Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to today's Friday Forum. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's event with MARIE FAVEREAU, discussing her new book, The Horde, How the Mongols Changed the World. She is joined in conversation today by Bryan Miller. Harvard Bookstore's Friday Forum takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. Through virtual events like today's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our digital community during this virtual age. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to buy a copy of The Horde, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual author series wouldn't exist. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors, incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these past many months, year and a half, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I am so excited to introduce today's speakers. MARIE FAVEREAU, is the Associate Professor of History at Paris Nanterre University. She has been a member of the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology, a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Study, and a research associate at the University of Oxford for major project Nomadic Empires. In addition to this text, she has written a graphic novel titled Genghis Khan. She is joined today by Bryan Miller. Bryan is a lecturer in history of art and research at the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology of the University of Michigan. He's been a research fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation at Bonn University and of the Faculty of History at the University of Oxford. In addition to conducting archaeological fieldwork in Mongolia, he is currently completing a book on Jianyu, the world's first nomadic empire. Today, they are discussing Marie's book, The Horde. This book takes a closer look at the Mongol Empire. For 300 years, the Horde was no less a force in global development than Rome had been. It left behind a profound legacy in Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, palpable to this day. Peter Frey-Gopin, author of The Silk Roads, called it outstanding, original, and revolutionary. Favreau subjects the Mongols to a much-needed reevaluation, showing how they were able to not only conquer, but control a vast empire, a remarkable book. And on that note of praise, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Marie, Bryan, thank you so much for being here. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
It's an extreme pleasure to be the person here talking with you about your book, Marie. It's been quite a while since we were sitting in Oxford together. So I'll start right off with asking you about how a book of this scale is certainly a monstrous undertaking. And you've clearly been engaged, whether anybody knows you personally or reads the book, that you've been engaged with research on the Mongols for decades. But can you summarize for any of the listeners some of the struggles you had, even after decades, with the sources for the research you had to engage with for this huge interdisciplinary book, as well as the processes themselves of that research that you encountered on your journey to compose this magnus opus and the final manuscript as we see it here?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bryan. I'm so happy to be here with you and, to continue our conversation about nomadic empires. I'm so happy to be here also with the audience. So yes, this book is a very long journey. So I would say that I start in a way working on it perhaps 20 years ago, just before I started my PhD. I was interested in Russia and Islam. I was working on the Middle Ages, and I discovered Russian books in Paris on the history of the Golden Horde, so the western part of the Mongol Empire, which I call the Horde. And so I was very excited about this topic. And I remember very well at that time going to my supervisor and asking, can I work on that? What can I do? I'm sure there's something here. I'm so excited. And he said, okay, you can try, but it's gonna be tough, and you're going to have to learn a number of languages, because there's one big issue, and it's the issue of the sources. That was one thing. And the other thing was the historiography. The historiography was mainly in Russian. There were a couple of interesting books in German and French and English, but mostly it was in Russian. So I was even more excited, and I traveled to Russia, and I started working on this topic. At that time, I was interested mainly in the 15th century. But I gathered sources, and I gathered so many sources that I didn't expect. I thought at the beginning, okay, I will have to, it's going to be complicated because there are nomads. Nomad, it means perhaps oral culture. This is something I discovered that was not for the Mongols. Mongols really developed an administrative imperial written culture. So they produced a lot of written acts, a lot of written orders in many languages. So for the Horde, mainly it's Turkic, so medieval Turkish. We have also documents in, of course, in Russian, translated also in Old Italian. We have documents in Persian, and it's also very good to learn some Mongolian languages, because at the Mongol Empire, there's this technical vocabulary that use those Mongol words too. So I would say that the first challenge for me was to try to study these languages. But at the end, I was so happy to discover that I had more sources than I expected. And I think that's that was the first step for me. And then I also discovered, while I was traveling in Russia, especially, that it was important to take into account the material culture and archaeology. Although I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a historian, I realized that material culture was crucial. I needed to see the object of everyday life used by the nomads. I needed to see the burial places. I needed to see the landscape. And that's also, transformed my, vision of the Horde and of this period. So that was also very important. Now, I would say that the second challenge, this I realized later after my PhD, when I was already a postdoctoral researcher, was more, how can I put that, like analytical. I realized, in fact, working on the Mongol, that it was such a sophisticated empire, actually. So now I can use the word, but at that time it was even, how can I put that, an issue to use the word empire. Really, an empire are nomad, so they can build empires. So that was one big thing. I realized that I lacked appropriate tools, because my Mongol, they don't have a capital, really. They build cities, but it's not, they don't have a centralization like in the Roman Empire, or it's a different kind of empire. And that was the second big challenge I had to face. And I was extremely lucky, because in 2014, I was involved in a major European program led by Pekka Hämäläinen on what it's called nomadic empires. And the idea was to compare different kind of nomadic empire. That's when we met Bryan, but we also met colleagues working on other Eurasian nomads, colleagues working on Africa. So that was, for me, that's when I really switched to something else. And that's where my book really started, in fact. So I realized, okay, now I have to use a more native vocabulary. So let's give up words like tribes, for instance, even empire. Let's start to dig into the sources and try to find out which words the Mongols themselves used. And that was really a great moment in my research, I had to say. But it was also a challenge because, you know, I had the feeling that we had to build everything. Yeah.
That's I'm glad you brought that up. It's definitely a challenge on how do you flip the script when all the narratives you have are written by the outsiders and not by a culture or a political entity themselves. How do you get through that lens of the, be it, you know, Persian sources or Chinese sources or anything else? And that said, I want to look at some of the really interesting sort of new lenses and new modes of thinking that developed in your book. Two of them, I'll go ahead and start off with this terminology, this more ethnic terminology that you mentioned. You use the term ulus, ordo, or horde. These are really critical. Beg for lord, rather than trying to have a sloppy translation of, do we call a beg a king or a duke or something like that? You just use that word. And you define them very clearly at the outset of your book. So they're nice tools that any reader can sort of pick up and go along. So I wanted to ask you, especially since anytime I mention your concept, your reinvention of the horde to some of my colleagues, they say, well, we can't use horde. That's just a ravaging army. I'm like, no, it's not. You really have to read Favreau's book. So I want you to, if you can, tell us very quickly how you went about reinventing, not really reinventing, but revitalizing the actual work of horde and what it can mean.
Yeah, thank you. About this term horde. So the term itself is an old word. It was already used you see it in Chinese sources during the Han period. You see it in the Turkic inscription of the Orkhon River of the 7th, 8th century. So the word itself was connected to the nomadic form of nomadic organization, military organization, clearly. But the Mongol used it in a more complex way, I realized, because I'm lucky working on the 13th to 15th century. I have more sources also that described what's in the camp, or how the nomads are organized, and so I realized that horde itself was not only about the army. It's not a military camp. It can be a military camp, but it's not only a military camp. And in fact, more and more I dig into the sources, I realize that it's like a mobile city. It's a little bit like a city because you have everything, city facilities, you have craftsmen, you have administration, all these are but mobile. So that was something that I didn't expect. I thought, I was taught that, you conquer on a horse, but you can't administrate on a horse. And I discovered that it was absolutely untrue, and that the Mongols were completely able to administrate on horses. And that changed my perception also of the term itself. I thought, okay, it's not only about conquest and military operations. It's also about government, administration. It's also about social life. It's also about political hierarchy. And so I really, tried in the book to describe these hordes. There's nothing, we cannot compare to anything today. Even, there are still nomads today, of course, but nothing similar to the medieval hordes. I think it was a gigantic phenomenon. They were huge. And when I say they were like mobile cities, it's because Western travelers would say, seeing them, oh my God, it's like a city, a walking city. And I think that's really important, because to keep the word horde, also because at that time, in half of the world, in Russia, in Europe, in the Middle East, they start using the word horde for the first time, the word we know today. They start using it in the 13th century, and they did not, the contemporaries, so they did not translate the word horde. They did not, because for them it was also completely new. They were extremely impressed by what they were seeing. So they kept the word, because there were no translation in sedentary languages, if I can put it that way. So it's really interesting, because today we have this idea about a horde, a bunch of people, brutality, disorganization, but hordes were extremely organized. So it has, nothing to do with what we think about, what we think a horde is today, the way we use the term. So I think it was a new form of empire, new form of political organization. And perhaps the best way, if we want to translate it, is really nomadic regime, for instance. I think it's very specific nomadic regime too. I think that's a good way to translate it. But anyway, there's no other words. It's horde. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really nice to see that there's so many connotations and a lot of baggage in that term. I think it is important, and I mentioned it as an emic term, and I'm just seeing a question pop up here about, you know, a lot of what we're talking about now, be it language and narratives or museums themselves, about decolonization. And how do you feel this is sort of a move toward the alternative narratives in the kind of book you're writing? And in that, I'll lead into the other sort of mode of thinking that you really put forward, a nice model, is this idea of redefining Pax Mongolica. And so you have this idea of, when that term came about, you know, people were trying to say, look, it's very important and very powerful. So if we have Pax Romanica for the Roman Empire, we also had Pax Mongolica. But I'm happy that you've gone that next step. You've said, well, you know, for people who say, well, it's not really a peace, and you say it wasn't ever meant to be a peace. So can you tell me about how you suddenly decided that there is something going on, but we should no longer have it just be the Mongol peace, the Mongol exchange?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, because it was also a key moment in my research, and I really benefit so much from all our conversation about, you know, nomadic empires. And so yes, we have this terminology, Pax Mongolica, so Mongol peace, to describe this period from, let's say, the 1250s to the 1350s. When there's a kind of economic boom, a lot of economic exchanges, trade transformed Eurasia. So a very specific moment, and a long century of form of globalization. And it was called traditionally Mongol peace, but we, not only me, also with other colleagues, were not very happy with the term, because we knew that there were a lot of, you know, there were also conflicts among Mongols. The Mongols themselves had the way of seeing peace that was more like a form of domination. So I started working on how the Mongols themselves envision peace. What does it mean for them? It's not that obvious. So I started working on that. And then I realized that this huge phenomenon, that a form of globalization that was that transformed Eurasia at that time and connected, you know, the Middle East, Russia, Asia, Europe also. That was a macro phenomenon, almost like the Columbian exchange. And I realized that it goes beyond the Mongol Empire. So it's in a way, it's fueled, it's created by the Mongols, but it goes well beyond the Mongol Empire. So it's not only the Mongol Empire. And I thought, okay, we need to label this. We need a word for that. And some of my colleagues already used Genghis exchange and also Mongolian exchange. So I thought that was a fantastic idea. I started to use those terms, but where my work is different, what my input is in the fact that I'm interested in the Horde, so the western part of the Mongol Empire, and in the north of the Mongol Empire. And so my idea, based on the sources, was to show how this major globalization moment also was really triggered by what was happening in the Horde, in this part of the Mongol Empire, because we tend to focus a lot on China and or on Europe and on the connection between China and Europe, but there's something in between. And so that was, all this process. I really was really coming from my research, and then I thought, okay, I have to explain this, and we need to have a new terminology, and Mongol exchange sounded really appropriate, much better than Mongol peace, because I was talking about the Mongol peace before, explaining that, yeah, but it's not really a peace, a lot of economic competition. So at the end of, no, okay, let's say something else, and that helped me a lot. So I think that what I hope is really clear in the book, that the Mongol peace is a major phenomenon. It's created mainly by the Mongols, but it's not only the Mongol Empire. That's why the Mongol heritage, like the legacy, is lasts much longer than the 14th, 15th century, because this big major phenomenon, the Mongol peace, is not a phenomenon of 1 century. It's gonna last. So yeah, so that's also a important, a key aspect of my research.
I'm happy you mentioned that word, legacy and heritage. There are a lot of things wrapped up in your book as well about the legacy for the world at large, and then also for the eventual polity that rose up in the footprint of the Mongols, and that's the Russian Empire.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned something also. You went north, and I applaud that part of your book, because so much of our concepts of Eurasia are wrapped up in the Silk Roads, and Silk Road's model of thinking is always east-west, 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 connecting China and Europe, these two civilized worlds, and everything else just sort of flatten. It's just like a Route 66, nothing really matters in the middle. But you have given such agency to the cultures and societies and political powers right in the middle, that they were really controlling what's going on. Yeah. And to them, they knew about that world to the north. And so can you talk about I talked to you before once, and you were mentioning all these like weird discoveries and new things about why are we not talking about the north? And so there's a whole chapter in your book about the Northern Road. So can you talk about this sort of under-researched idea of Siberia being this massive breadbasket of resources for not only the Mongol regimes, but later Russian regimes as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bryan. Yes, I think that was something that I didn't expect at all. I thought, I had when I started this book, I really didn't expect that all this information on the north and on the northern route or northern road. So I think that how can I put that? So this when we work on the Mongol Empire and on the travelers, especially on Marco Polo, for instance, or on Ibn Battuta, very, very famous travelers, we tend to focus on what I call the Southern Road. So the road that was controlled by the Ilkhanids, by the Toluids, and that actually this road connected Iran, Tabriz, so Azerbaijan, Iran to China. And it was indeed an important road, but for a moment, the north, what I call the northern road that connected, so Mongolia to through Russia today to Eastern Europe and to Italy, actually. For a moment, this road was one of the most important, I think, in the world. So, and that was the time of the Horde. So I started working on this road, try to understand how it developed, where were the stops, where were the main cities. And I discovered that actually the Italians, especially the Venetians, had some information. They used this road. And so we have, so I explained this in the book, but the Mongols had, they didn't let the Italians go really north. So the Mongols kept for themselves parts of this road because they opened the network, but not all the network. That's the whole idea. So to keep control of it. So they let the Venetians, for instance, enter the Mongol Empire, have huge privileges, trade privileges, but in the north, there are places where the Venetians don't go. And so that was something I didn't expect, actually. I thought, okay, this is the road that is described by Pigolotti and other Italian traders. And then I discovered, no, there's something else more in the north. And that was connected to the discovery I made on the importance of the fur trade. I started working on the Horde with a strong knowledge of the slave trade, because I spent time in Egypt. I know about the slave trade, the Mamluk trades. So I thought that's one of the main trade in the Horde. But then I discovered afterward that especially the fur trade was probably fur trade was the most important, the most fruitful trade for the Mongols. And that also explained why the Horde was one of the most important regime within the Mongol Empire in Eurasia. So now my project is also to work even more on the north and to try to go to certain places and try to understand how this network, Siberian network, worked. I think that's really something fantastically interesting. It's also connected to another discovery I made. In fact, something that surprised me completely. It's about rivers. So I was told also when I was a student, and nomads, they ride horses and they are in the steppes and they don't really, they don't like water, they don't have boats. The more and more I worked on the Horde, it was clear that they had river boats, that they always live near river valley, especially lower river valley, that they use rivers for to connect also for traveling. They are like, how do you say that, the highways, those rivers, especially when they are frozen in winter. And the way they master those rivers, the way they use them, it's I think it's one of their major achievements in at least in the west of the Mongol Empire, in the Horde. Really, they use them for transportation, but also to sort of stop the sedentary people who had more trouble to cross rivers, because Mongols were more skilled. For that, they knew how to cross rivers, even if there were no bridge, for instance. So, or they forced sedentary subjects to cross rivers at certain points where they taxed them. So they used rivers as a tool for domination, and this I absolutely didn't expect. And I thought that it was a really really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and speaking of a lot of things you've already touched on about how this, yes, we can now call it an empire, is completely different from all of our assumptions, which admittedly are rooted in our understanding of one empire, that's the Roman Empire. But in addition to how you looked at much more adept terms like the Horde and Ulus and other things, another thing you touched on in your book is this idea, especially in the medieval world, in the time period of the Crusades, where you have the Christian world of Europe versus the Islamic world, this idea of two cultures and two worlds. Each world only has one religion, and that's it. One state, one religion. But you've done a really good job of showing how the Horde and all of these Mongol rulers really embraced multiple religions. Can you explain just a little bit briefly how that actually worked and why they consciously went for it?
Yeah. Well, no, that's also something I think is I'm happy you raised this point. That's something important. The fact that when I started working on the Horde, at the time when we called it the Golden Horde, it was considered as a Muslim state almost. But in fact, I realized that there were very important Christian communities, that there were Jewish communities in Crimea, for instance, that they were protected by the Mongol power, that also the Mongols themselves were also, we call them Tengrists, but they still had their beliefs, that are not Muslim, that are different, that old steppe beliefs. And they were probably we know that there are traces of Buddhism too in the Horde. So that's I thought I have to explain this, because this is something that is this multi-religious thing is amazing. How they made it, how they did it, because it worked. You don't see really religious. You see some religious conflict, but not that much, really not. So I was fascinated by that. And I understood that the Mongols, so they don't force people to change their religion. You can have the religion you want, but they made deal. It's we call it Mongol toleration, but it's really a religious policy, in fact. So they made deal with the religious elites. So the clergy, actually, where the Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, Taoist, they made deal with them. The idea was they had the clergy, so the high level priests had to be loyal. They had to pray for them. They had to build also an institution to praise the Mongols, but then they don't have to pay taxes. They got, in exchange for that, they got tax exemptions, and also they didn't have to go, of course, to do the conscription, and they could escape, the army and everything. So, but the tax exemption thing is a major, crucial feature, in fact, because it explains how all these religious elites became wealthy, really, and wealthier during the end of the 13th century, 14th century, and even early 15th century. So they benefited so much from the tax exemption and they transform their wealth into buildings. They also bought lands. So they prospered, really. And so it's all connected to the economy too. So that's also the idea in my book, was not just to distinguish between, religion here, economy there, society there. No, it's all together. You have to consider this as a kind of system. And so the way the Mongol envision religion, the way they accept different religion, as soon as people respect their or praise their power or support them, it actually was really one of the pillar of their power. I mean, it really was part of their domination, but it transformed into something that was rather impressive at the end, because when you see the number of stone churches that were built in what is Russia today in the 14th century, it's completely amazing. While you think, okay, in the Horde, the Mongols are supposedly Muslim, but they support this amazing, building program of stone churches. And here I was lucky because I found really interesting documentation. Also, for Jewish communities in Crimea, they could build also their own, religious buildings, schools. So yeah, that's something I think that should be underlined. And that's, we used to have this, to use this expression, this phrase, Mongol tolerance. But it's important to explain what's in it. It's like Mongol peace. Well, but what's in it exactly? So that's also the idea, was to show how they build this incredible system, which is, which you don't find anywhere else. You don't find in Western Europe. You don't find in the Muslim world. The Muslim world is a completely different system. So that's something so specific to the Mongols. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy you sort of take to task that word toleration, because it seems to be, if it's just Mongol toleration, they're sort of passively allowing, I guess, for these things. But the way you describe it now and in your book is, it wasn't passive at all. It was a very active strategy of state building and economy building on the statewide scale and on the local scale in every single region. This brings us back to all these struggles that you had, not just on the data, but also the deeply rooted concepts and assumptions about this. And I'm seeing a question now here in the Q&A about, can you talk a little bit about where you think these assumptions came from? At what point did it seem like we had this assumption about the Horde and the backwardness and all these other things that you had to struggle against? When does this really start to come about? At the time of the Mongols or later? Or?
Well, that's a good question. I think there were, I think later. Well, yeah, I think later. Even in the Russian historiography, in the Russian sources, the really harsh discourses against the Mongols is something that appeared quite late. I would say really 16th century, probably. So really, when after actually the Mongols. After the Horde, in fact. And but I would say that the current, it's not the current historiography now, because now we have all changed. Something I share with colleagues, this new views on nomads. But I would say that the really nationalist historiography, maybe in the 19th century, early 20th century, you see the Mongol Empire doesn't fit with nation states. The Mongol Empire crossed borders. It's not, you cannot frame it in a nationalist discourse. So for the Russian, it was seen as a negative period, a destructive period at that time. For the Iranian, in the Middle East too, they had a very negative vision. It changed now, but they had a very negative vision of the Mongol, while the Mongol supported Islam in many ways. So that's interesting, and but because it didn't fit. So if you really, how can I put that? The Mongols, they don't. There are so many people that are involved in this history. So they covered so many lands and cultures. It's so diverse that if you want to have just a box with one people, one language, one ethnic, it doesn't work. So I think the nationalist historiography also, maybe perhaps in China also, was sometimes seeing the Mongols very negatively because of that reason. But I'm really happy to say that now this is really changing.
Yeah, it's an amazing journey of research and struggles and trying to reconceptualize things. Can you at least, if we come full circle, so to speak, from the first question I had for you, to the issue of how you go about making this book? I mean, it's you. This is your labor of love and sweat and tears here. But what do you think are some of the, for anybody that's trying to understand the long process of writing such a huge book, what are some of the things that you feel really helped you along the way, and more specifically people that were indispensable?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this book is really, for me, there should be 1,000 names on the front cover. I mean, it's really a collective book, and yeah, I'm so happy to say it. It's, of course, I think the Nomadic Empires project led by Pekka Hamalainen, when we met also with all my colleagues in Oxford at that time, it changed completely I mean, it's really, it gave me the word, the energy, and really the will to transform the concept. And so I think that was really a major moment, and a human moment, because we had a lot of discussions. There were so many things that I didn't understand. There are still things that I struggle with, I try to understand. It's a very specific institution. The fact that we could exchange, that was really fantastic for me. And then after, I was so lucky to work with Harvard University Press. They were so supportive. My editor really helped me to turn this giant project into a book. I mean, and then you have to give up on certain things, focus on others. So it's extremely important, the relationship with the editor, I think. And I appreciate so much that we could exchange a lot, and I felt really, really helped in this matter. And that also was so important. There are also two persons who helped me a lot. And they are really part of the book. One is Maha Nakama, with whom I work on the illustration. So she did the drawings of the objects I wanted to see in the book. So objects from the Mongol culture, from the Horde, that were found mainly in Russia during archaeological excavations. And she made fantastic drawings from these objects. And I think that it was very important for me to show objects really from the Jochid, from the Horde. And this is artwork, really amazing. And also, of course, Alexander Kent, who's a cartographer, and with whom I work on the maps. So that's also another really important aspect of this book. I think it's we put so much effort and so passion into the map. Drawing that was so important for me too, and with Alexander Kent from Canterbury University, we really decided to create completely the map. So it was a lot of discussion with him too, because I had ideas, but then if you want to make really build your map, you need to also take into account technical issues and everything. So that was absolutely fantastic, and I really want in my future project to continue with this kind of work with maps. I mean, with cartographers. I think it's essential. We don't have good maps for for our periods exactly, and yeah, it's and it's also you can put a lot of imagination, creativity in maps. I think we should use this. These are our tools. So we should make them really our own, right? And not always use the same kind of map. So we tried things with Alexander Kent, and that was also fantastic. That they at the end in the book itself, it's I think it appears, it's clear that the maps have their are important. They have like a primary place. Yeah.
Nice. I'm just looking at the Q&A things, and now for something completely different, slightly.
Okay.
Something that I know I deal with every time I go to Mongolia, and people say, "Oh, what about Mongolian barbecue?" Which, of course, we know is a bizarre myth that came into the making. But there's a question about what about diet among the Mongolians? And for this, I assume what we know most about is among the, relatively speaking, elite members of Mongolian society. Did their food adapt as the empire grew and changed? Especially, this makes me think of when they come into contact with other groups versus when they move into totally new regions. Can you talk at all about changes in diet and cuisine?
Well, yeah, I think what we know is, so of course they add a lot of meat, but they also something that I focus on in I think in my third chapter is the fermented mare milk, so that we know as kumis or airak, right? And this fermented mare milk that they drank a lot during spring and summer was really a key part of their diet. It allowed them to survive, actually, almost also. So this is something I thought that was so important. So milk is dairy products. I did something I didn't expect, but then I had to I realized that it was so important. Socially, it was important. Of course, there's something political behind it, but also it helps them to have a safe diet, like a healthy diet, because they have a lot of meat. So that's one key thing. Otherwise, of course, the relationship with the sedentary communities. We know that they bought grains, and that they also had fish also. So we know that they had a kind of a large, a number of products, in fact, at least at the end of the 13th century and in the 14th century, and that they were very strong at that time. So things changed later on, but the climate changed too in the 15th century. Dairy products.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a centrality of dairy products even back 2,000 years beforehand. I guess one thing I'm interested in is, did you see any interesting food products? I mean, we know that in the steppe for thousands of years, they had already been doing minimal agriculture and other things. They had mixed up. But are there any bizarre food types or food practices or types of vessels that they had that sort of crept into, that weren't normal Mongol ways of doing things, that as they sort of became more of a cosmopolitan power, that they brought in?
Wow, it's hard to tell. I know that they have access to more products. Oh, well, yeah, I don't have a lot of sources on that, but more sugar. That's for sure. Yeah, that's clear. At the end of the 13th century, you see something change in the diet, and they were not really used to have really sugar. And then they have a lot of sweet things after at the end of the 13th century. That sound, when you look at the sources, new to them. So that's what I have in mind right now. But there certainly we will discover more thanks to probably research, like through excavation, research on burials and on skeleton and DNA, perhaps. I think there's much more, of course, to say.
So there's another question here about Uyghurs and Kazakhs, and it makes me think about so often when we think about the Horde, or the Golden Horde, as you would have it, about its relationship with the Russian principalities and with Europe. But the Horde itself covered most of what is now modern-day Kazakhstan and others. Yeah. Can you talk about their relationship, not just with the Europeans, so to speak, but with the existing people right there in the heart of Central Eurasia?
Well, yeah, I can try. The thing is, I think one of the social process I wanted to show in my book was that the way they absorb other people, the way Mongols actually, because Mongol, you really have to understand this name as a political name. So you can be transformed into a Mongol, right? So that was the idea, is really to this idea of absorption. I think it's really important that's something we see in other nomadic empires, and that's something really key to understand how the Mongol became stronger and more numerous, and how they also were able to live like in peace with local nomads in certain areas. And but of course, so behind the word Mongol itself, there were so many different, tribes, if you want to use this word, or, clans, or but the term Kazakh appears. So I try to show it in the book that it appears at the end of the Horde. In fact, the term itself became really important, really under Toktami, even a little bit after that. So really 15th century, really end of the 14th century and 15th century. This terminology like Uzbek, Kazakh starts being really important and used by people to as collective names, really. It comes from the Horde, but it was not there before. So it's a late development of the Horde society, in fact. Uzbek, Kazakh, Tatar also, in fact.
Yeah. Any mention of the word or the region, what we now know as Khazaria?
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
Khazaria. There's a question about any research related to Khazaria.
Yeah, so the Lower Volga, the Khazar state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, there's no, you mean connection, the name, or?
Just any research on the relationship between the Horde and...
Yeah. Okay, I understand. Yes, thank you. We saw, I have my colleague Irina Shingirai. We work on the Khazar in the lower, so men in the lower Volga. So we really try to work together and try to understand if there were connections, because this is the same landscape, this is the same place. So clearly the Khazar left something that the Mongol, the Horde, used, certainly, and there are not enough research on that. That's extremely interesting. Yes, absolutely, and there's an avenue for research there. So and that the same area is fantastically interesting. Yeah.
You mentioned one further avenue of investigation post-publication of this book is definitely the relationship with the northern regions. Are there any other avenues of research now that you sort of stand back and look at this book that you think, I really want to go more into that direction? This thing I didn't look at enough and I want to do it more.
Many, actually. It's hard to, but I would say that also the connection with Northern Europe. So it's still the connection with the North, but all the trade routes. I think so. We all know about the ANSA, the Hanseatic League, for instance. But they are, it's really connected to the trade development in the Horde. So I would like to work more also on that, to sort of show that during this period, there's an incredible integration of what is Russia today, but also Northern Europe. So the connection with Northern Europe and Eastern Europe also is extremely, extremely interesting. And it's, I would like to work more on that too. And also my idea in the future would be to work also more on burials. I still have to say that funerary practices of the Mongols, it's completely crazy. It's so hard to understand. It's so complex, so rich. I'm fascinated by the way they envision, I think, the afterlife. I think I found more and more information on that in the written sources, and now I'm interested in checking more, funerary objects, burials, try to understand where certain cemeteries were located, understand their landscape, really their religious landscape in a way. So I think also that's yeah, so that would be fantastic. As soon as I can go back there, I will do that.
As an archaeologist, I'm not going to complain about further discoveries. And then one last question. Well, this is a good one. Have been at least a couple of books that I know of that have come out recently about the role of women in the Mongol Empire.
Oh.
And certainly, if you look at even archaeological excavations, you see it as well. Can you talk about what you see in the case of the Horde about the role of women, especially in the elite levels of society, in leadership positions?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's amazing because they are so visible on the diplomatic political scene. I mean, the Mongol, they don't hide women. So that's the travelers, Westerners, Muslim, also visitors. You see that in the sources, they were shocked and they were so surprised. You see women, I mean, they can talk to you and they show themselves in public, and they can receive gifts and make gift exchange with you. And when the Khan or the sovereign is not at home, she can replace her husband and stuff like that. So clearly, on that too, the Mongols act differently. I mean, they were really different, and that's I think an interesting aspect. If we just focus on the Horde, not on the Mongols, in general, is that in the Horde, even when they converted to Islam, they didn't change this. The women remain unveiled. They remain extremely visible, so publicly visible. They remain extremely predominant and important. They they financed, sponsored buildings. They played a very important role in the in the everyday life, and then also in this imperial life too. And I think that's very, very interesting aspect. And there are a number of princesses that who founded religious building, madrasas, so schools, Sufi also lodges, and I hope that I can in the future have at least an article on with other colleagues on the role of those elite women.
And then lastly, well, we got a couple questions. Very quickly, if you had to list all the languages you had to learn in order to do this research, what would they be?
Well, I would say, okay, so Russian, Arabic, Turkish, it's Italian, I mean, Latin, a bit of Persian, and now Mongol language, which I work more and more on Mongolian language, which I'm very fond of, and I try to read all the inscriptions. Well, yeah, I would say so, but that as a historian, so we have to deal with different language, and anyway, I work with, it's a teamwork. Also work with my colleagues, specialize on Chinese sources. Like you, for instance, we exchange also. So yeah.
And then coming back, I guess, to the Mongol exchange question, you had mentioned you used the term globalization a lot. And how do you think this Mongol exchange organizational system worked to change what we would call globalization at that time period?
Thank you.
Say globalization started here. No, it started here. No, it started here.
Yeah,
the book is the case of a peak of globalization. And how do you think the Mongols changed that?
Yeah, well, okay, it's a very interesting question. So it's true, I use the term globalization. The thing is, it's globalization in the sense that there are all those new connections, and there are this integration of the north of Eurasia. So we can speak about globalization, but for me, still something that I want to work on is it's not capitalism neither. I mean, it's a different form of globalization, right? So what kind of globalization is that, and what do the Mongol want? I mean, how do they build new economic rules to make things circulate. So they clearly want to see objects, things, people circulated. And it was very interesting for me because I really tried to understand why do they want that circulation. And I really deeply think that it's connected to the way they envision the afterlife also. There's something also, because for them, when things circulate, there's happiness in the society. There are also, in the rituals with the dead, you can integrate the dead into the society in a better way. So that's something I explain in the book, and also based on work done by anthropologists. And it's clear that to understand the way this globalization took shape, it's important to understand the Mongol motivation behind it and the kind of rules it developed and how it worked, but and also the limits of it, of course. So because it's not the globalization we have today, so it's different form of globalization, and it's hard to think of, to think of it because it's so different, but still it's a form of globalization.
Nice. I think I heard an alarm that we are out of time, and I see no questions. So I will thank you so much for inviting me, of all people, to be your conversation partner, and thank Audrey and everybody at the Harvard Bookstore for hosting the event.
Yeah, thank you so much, Audrey. It was a huge pleasure to share with you.
Oh, this was a blast for me too, particularly learning that the Mongols were really into milk and sweets. Was not expecting that. That's very new information to me. But thank you so much, Bryan and Marie, for being here and giving this wonderful talk. It's been absolutely fabulous. And thank you to everyone who's watching from home today and showing up for authors, indie publishers, and book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you'd like to support Marie in the bookstore, there is a link in the chat where you can purchase the Horde. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.